Today we are going to begin with Human Virtues, Unit 2, Part 1. Now the objectives of this module are that any theory of morality which makes virtues the central concern is called as virtue ethics. In this unit, we are going to explore the idea of virtue ethics of Aristotle and also of contemporary Western philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, and also look at ethics of care and see how deontological theories are different from virtue ethics. Among the major trends that now dominate moral philosophy, virtue ethics counterbalances the influence of Kantianism. While the Kantian ethics attempts to revitalize the ethical importance of happiness, virtue ethics rejects the Enlightenment project that founds morality on reason and brings to the forefront the question of happiness and that of nature. By what logic is this shift made possible, and how does it reconcile altruism inherent in Kant's ethics of duty with more personal research of our own happiness? In the legacy of Kant, one cannot define morality from within the framework of happiness, because that would make desire to be the foundation of the moral will, and desire by definition varies from individual to individual. Therefore, for Kant, it was important that happiness could not be the foundation or the grounding principle on which to base any theory of morality, as there is no fixed definition of happiness that is available to us. If everyone is in search of one's own happiness, the very content of each person's happiness is personal. So how would one go about making a universal moral law? In other words, according to Kant, in order for us to frame a universal moral law, it has to be necessary, and of course it has to apply to everyone across board, irrespective of their caste, gender, race, color, sex, and their own. If happiness were to be the deciding factor, then we could not develop a universal moral law, for the conception of happiness differs from person to person. In order to prevent moral conscience from relativism in the pursuit of goals, Kant opposed the pursuit of happiness by consciousness of duty, enabled through the categorical imperative as a universal obligation. Thus, we see that in Kant's philosophy or Kant's presentation of the moral law, since happiness is relative to different individuals, it could not become the grounding principle to frame a moral law. Therefore, he thought it is better that if we were to operate in fulfilling our moral duties, or in fulfilling or following the moral law, more out of our consciousness of duty, and that would be enabled through the categorical imperative. And that imperative we all recognize and accept as a universal obligation. Before we go on to discuss Aristotle's virtue ethics, I would like to highlight how in ethics in recent times, a resurgence for need for happiness has been gaining ground, where happiness is not simply maximization of pleasure, but as the perfection of one's own existence. So if we begin with or look at how in recent times there has been a trend where one is reassessing or re-looking at happiness, and we are not just talking about happiness that is centered in an individual or just looking at pleasure of an individual, but rather where we are looking at happiness which could imply that we go on to perfect or we go on to develop our own existence or our own persona as a human being. One can look at the work of Alasdair MacIntyre and Elizabeth Anscombe in this regard. Both of them have looked at virtue as a form of excellence in the realization of one's being. So both Alasdair MacIntyre and Elizabeth Anscombe, which we will be dealing later on in other parts of this unit, have looked at virtue or have revisited virtue as a kind of excellence, that excellence which we can develop, and that development of the excellence will help us realize our own being. Here, I would like to begin with Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia. Aristotle 384 to 322 BC has been considered as one of the most influential thinkers of all times. He was born in Stygira in northern Greece and moved to Athens when he was 17. He became a student of Plato and left Athens after Plato's death in 347 BC. 4 years later, he became a tutor to Alexander the Great, and from 334 BC until his death, Aristotle headed his own school in Athens. Aristotle is one of the founders of virtue ethics in Greece. He says that the human person is a rational animal, and this essential characteristic of being rational leads to achieve a particular goal or end, which Aristotle calls virtue. Now, Aristotle wrote the Nicomachean Ethics in 325 BC, and the central questions that he has asked or raised in the Nicomachean Ethics are centered around what is the good of man, or they're discussing or questions about character. And Aristotle's answer is, it is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. So what exactly would define a good man? Well, it would be a soul which is working in conformation with virtue. To understand ethics, therefore, one will have to understand what makes someone a virtuous person. And Aristotle has devoted a lot of passages in the Nicomachean Ethics to discuss particular virtues like courage, self-control, generosity, truthfulness, as well as temperance, and many others. But before Aristotle, even Socrates and Plato and other ancient thinkers had also discussed what is it that makes one a good person. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explains the nature of good life and what it means to be virtuous, as he states or asks, what is the function of man? If, for example, we were to take the example of a carpenter, what would be his function? Well, his function would be A, to design the objects in a proper manner, and B, be proficient in that work. Likewise, if we were to ask, what is the function of man? Well, then it has to be that whatever we do, whatever actions that we do, A, they are in keeping with our reason, because we are definitely more than simply a functioning being. Because that quality of being a functioning being, we share even with plants and animals. There is something that definitely sets it apart from the plants and animals, and that, of course, is our capacity to reason, to think. And in that manner, Aristotle felt that if we were to dwell on that concept on that capacity within us, which is that of reasoning, and we were to perform our actions in keeping with our reason, we would surely go on to or move on in the direction of functioning and achieving what is it to be a virtuous human being. Therefore, for man, it is to function as per his reason and perform actions that are just and right. In this respect, eudaimonia or happiness, as it has been loosely translated, implies flourishing of human life. Aristotle was aware that all our actions aim at some end or goal or purpose. These ends are either ends in themselves or means to other ends. So if we look at Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia or happiness, it has been translated as happiness, which is a loose translation. But what actually Aristotle was talking about was that how all of our actions are directed towards achievement of some end or goal. And these ends are either they are ends in themselves or they are means to achieving other ends. Ends in themselves have a greater value for Aristotle. Why? Because they all lead to eudaimonia or the greatest good. Now, in order to achieve eudaimonia, Aristotle believed that we had to act in a virtuous manner. Before I go on to do that, I would like to explain what Aristotle understood by virtues. Aristotle said that a virtue is a trait, is a quality that we human beings possess. And how does it get manifested? Well, it gets manifested in our habitual actions. The term habitual is important because it implies that we are committed to following or adapting a certain type of behavior. For example, if someone were to tell the truth, then that person cannot be doing that or telling the truth as and when it suits them or the occasion, and lie when it does not suit them. Because according to Aristotle, then it would not be a virtuous activity. Habitual basically means that we stick with that pattern of behavior of telling truth, however pleasant or unpleasant it may be. Therefore, virtue is basically a trait, a quality that we human beings possess, and that virtuous quality gets manifested when we do actions out of habit. Aristotle went on to divide virtues into two categories. They are actually two broad categories, intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Now, intellectual virtues are those that can be taught and learnt. Moral virtues, on the other hand, develop out of habit. So, it is the moral virtues that are not inherent in us. Rather, we receive them, and their development is dependent on habit. Thus, moral virtues, according to Aristotle, are good to have. Not to say that intellectual virtues are not important, but intellectual virtues, like I mentioned earlier, are those that can be taught and learned, whereas moral virtues you observe and you can relearn them, readapt them, and depending on the habit that we form about them. If moral virtues are good and are something we can develop by habit, then what are those virtues that we can learn and develop by habit? Now, the virtues, to name a few, would include fairness, generosity, loyalty, courage, tolerance, self-discipline, temperance, and many other that Aristotle may have mentioned. Not that the list is exhaustive, it's just a few examples of what virtues would be. If we examine some of these virtues, we can understand what Aristotle meant by the golden mean. Now, why is it that Aristotle talked about the golden mean? Because he realized that when we are talking about virtues, as a human being, we ought not to lean on any of the two extremes. And it is best to adopt a path of the golden mean. Now, the virtues that I am going to take examples of and explain to explain this concept of the golden mean need not necessarily be the same virtues that Aristotle may have highlighted, but the fact that I have taken these examples is just to explain to you what do we understand by the idea of the golden mean. So let's take and begin with the first virtue, that is courage or fortitude. Now, what is courage? According to Aristotle, virtues are a mean. They are a mean between two extremes of excess as well as deficiency. So, courage would be what? It would be a mean between cowardice and foolhardiness. In other words, to take the example of a soldier should not run away from the battlefield if he sees too many, enemy approaching in front of him, because that would be the extreme of, deficiency. And rather, he should not fight the enemy alone too, because that would be an extreme of excess. So what would courage or fortitude mean? He would have to exercise his reason as well as his capacity of not being scared or having fear in between the two excesses and take a decision accordingly. The second example that I am taking of is generosity. What does generosity imply? It implies one's capacity to help others. Now, Aristotle said that this too is a means. It is a means between two extremes of being stingy and extravagant. The stingy person gives too little and the extravagant gives too much. So what would be the golden mean position? It would be somewhere between we help people without compromising our ordinary lives, and yet we are careful with our help. In other words, we are not too selfish and stingy with the money or whatever that we want to donate to help others. Rather, and we should also not be at the same time extravagant, whereby we allow someone to constantly exploit us. The third example that I am taking is that of honesty. Honesty is a trait where the person does not generally lie. But then what would be the golden mean? Well, in the case of honesty, it would be not to lie, but if suppose a rare situation demanded it, then one can consider it. In other words, an honest person will have to be able to tell the truth and yet at the same time act from a degree of self-preservation. So, that would be the best way to deal and coexist in a society without compromising our coexistence. To take another example, if you're an honest person and your friend is involved or is afflicted with a rare disease, where you do not want to dishearten your friend and want him or her to continue with the treatment, as an honest friend, you would tell and sympathize or empathize with your friend, discuss about the rare disease, but you may not at the same time share the information that has been told to you by the doctor, because you are also acting not only from a degree of self-preservation, but you also want to further strengthen your friend's belief in the fact that yes, he or she will get cured from that disease. Fourth is loyalty to family and friends. It's another example of a moral virtue. We all need family and friends and feel a special degree of loyalty towards them as compared to strangers. To give an example, Socrates in the dialogue Euthyphro is surprised to know that the son had come to prosecute his father for murder, because for Euthyphro, justice is justice. So what would be the golden mean here? Even though it was his father, Euthyphro thought that no, because it is justice that is at stake, he could not allow his father to go free. So the question is, what would be the golden mean here? Now, in the case of family and friends, we often find that loyalty would be important, but so would impartiality be. One would have to balance both loyalty as well as impartiality in order to be able to coexist in a harmonious manner. The question that arises is, then why are virtues important? They are, no doubt, traits of our character and are good for people to have. But why should one develop them? Well, the reason could be that each of the virtues are important and significant in their own right. They need to be developed because all the virtues are essential for different reasons. The virtues, they help in the development of a wholesome personality. Aristotle believed that virtues should be developed because virtuous people live a better life. Aristotle is highlighting here the fact that we, as social creatures, live in communities, and in order for all of us to have a harmonious relationship, it is better to develop virtues. Courage will help us in dealing with dangerous situations. Honesty will help us in invoking trust in each other. Generosity will help us in developing a feeling of empathy towards each other. Therefore, we all need virtues because they are the qualities that we need to acquire by habit to become better human beings. The four important virtues, according to Aristotle, are wisdom, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. Prudence, according to him, is an intellectual virtue that we can learn from others. What does prudence involve? Well, it involves being practical, being careful, using one's intellect or reason and learn from others and think and act in that manner. Wisdom and temperance would definitely again be intellectual virtues, but courage is a moral virtue. Thus, virtues, whether intellectual or moral, are best exhibited, according to Aristotle, when they lie between two extremes. Virtue ethics. If we look at virtue ethics, then all thinkers owe it to Aristotle for highlighting the significance of virtuous living. The contemporary virtue ethicists give importance to the character of a person rather than compliance with certain norms of right behavior. This does not mean that they ignore moral obligations. Rather, they affirm the primacy of moral obligations. The reason that they have focused on primacy of virtue ethics is because, according to the contemporary virtue ethicists, moral obligations can only be derived from virtues. So for them, mere following or adhering to moral precepts will not satisfactorily respond to challenges in leading a moral life. A complete study of ethics will have to take into account many factors such as motives and intentions. Significance of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is appealing. Why? Because it provides a natural and attractive account of moral motivation. So why would one sign up or agree with a theory of virtue ethics say as against a deontological theory of Kant? Well, according to the supporters or thinkers who support virtue ethics, the reasons can be because it provides a very natural and normal and attractive account of moral motivation. And if theories of ethics only talked about right action, then they would lose out on many other important aspects of our lives, be it friendship, loyalty, empathy, love, which are all, according to the virtue ethicists, important, and they can be and are at times good as motivating factors for action. Therefore, moral virtues are good for the development of human beings. Virtue ethicists question the concept of impartiality as a motivating factor for actions. Utilitarianism highlighted impartiality as an essential element of the moral agent's character. But should impartiality be an essential feature of a moral theory? Now that's a question that is being raised by the virtue ethicist. Should moral theories be always impartial? The virtue ethicists recognize that there is this aspect of impartiality, but at the same time they are also aware that a theory of virtue can too incorporate impartiality. The reason why virtue theory or virtue ethics can imbibe or impart or import impartiality, the concept of impartiality, is because the reason is that some virtues are partial and some are not, and each of the virtue is of a different kind. Therefore, any moral theory will have to keep these differences in mind and develop them accordingly as the virtues are. Therefore, the virtue ethicists, when they focus on how the development of virtues adds to the progress of the moral life of an individual, and because they would recognize that virtues are partial and each virtue is different, then therefore automatically the concept of impartiality would creep in any theory of virtue ethics. Now I go on to evaluate virtue ethics. Virtue ethics offers a better motive for the action than a duty-based one. However, there are certain shortcomings in virtue ethics that have been highlighted by their critics. Now, what are those shortcomings? Like I mentioned earlier, it offers a better motive for the action than a duty-based theory of ethics. Why? Because it is recognizing that we do have these concepts of empathy, generosity, wisdom, temperance, love, loyalty, courage. All of these are a part and parcel of the human persona, and it need not always be the case that whenever we want to do an action, it will always get prompted from the perspective of it being a duty. Therefore, for the virtue ethicist, all these aspects which are a part and parcel of our persona are also there to motivate us to do our actions. But the critics of virtue ethics have pointed out certain shortcomings of this theory. They are as follows. First, virtue ethical theories basically lack moral principles, and any theory of ethics which does not have a backing of moral principles, according to them, cannot provide the necessary guidance. So for the critics of virtue ethicists, unless and until there is a foundation of moral principles that are available, then any theory of ethics which does not have these moral principles will not be in a position to provide the necessary guidance as any deontological theory would be. Virtue ethics can best tell us that we have to follow the model of virtuous person, but it does not specify or give guiding principle as to what virtuous person would do exactly in that situation. The argument is circular. The action is virtuous as it is done by a right person, and a person is right if the action is virtuous. We need other guiding principle and need to move beyond virtue ethics. The second reason is that there is a lack of moral judgment in virtue ethics. A person can be virtuous, but they still may not be able to distinguish between right action from a wrong action. Therefore, rightness or wrongness of actions, according to the critics, is not dependent on the virtuous character of the person. Therefore, one needs moral standards independent of the character of a person, to judge the moral rightness or wrongness of an action. So, in other words, it means the virtuous person's persona or character is independent of the rightness or wrongness of an action. And in order to be able to judge that, we need an impartial principle of morality, or to judge right action from a wrong action. The third reason is that there can be situations in which virtues can enter into a conflict with one another. For example, if a person comes across a situation comes across in a dilemma, or a situation in which there is a dilemma, then virtue ethics, according to the critics, is not able to provide an answer, as virtues conflict with one another. Deontology and virtue ethics share the same conflict situation, because even in the case of Kant, it was not specified that which duty amongst the three versions of the categorical imperative which would come first if there were to be a conflict between them. So neither virtue ethics nor deontological theories of morality help us in resolving conflict situations. The proponents of the duty-based ethics suggest that conflicts between norms of duty can still be resolved by determining the prominence of one norm over another. This, however, does not seem possible in virtue ethics unless there are guiding principles to ascertain as to which virtues are more important than other virtues. Therefore, virtue ethics as a theory of ethics has shortcomings and is open to criticism. Further, it fares no better than other deontological or consequentialist theories that have been propounded till now. Thank you.